Well, thanks so much for having me. Thanks to John and Anya and the other organizers. There's a little bit of sarcasm in that they stuck me between two really fascinating papers and lunch. So I will try to minimize your disappointment here. So I'm going to be describing some of my research from the last few years using alumni giving. And I think that alumni giving presents a really great opportunity to study philanthropy for a couple of reasons. You've got sort of a better defined donor base. If you're soliciting your alumni, you sort of know who your denominator is. And you tend to know a bit more about the donors. That, of course, depends on how much record keeping the university does. And finally, my experience both at Anonymous University, thank you, John, and at Texas A&M is that people in higher education development tend to be really open to experiments and, if not experiments, at least allowing their data to be used by researchers, which is really great. So we use data from a private selective research university that I call Anonymous University, and we looked at a bunch of different questions. And when I say we, a lot of this work was done with my my friend and frequent co-author Harvey Rosen at Princeton. So we've looked at some questions on fundraising, and some questions on life cycle giving, habit formation, and our most recent paper on end-of-life giving. We've also looked at what here I call impure motivations to altruism, but you could think of these papers also as being life cycle related, having to do with the family, and then just generally about the family, though we were using the presence of children who are applying to the school to measure the degree of impurity and altruism. And then some sort of alumni-specific questions like the impact of athletic performance and the impact of financial aid, and as I mentioned, a lot of these papers were co-authored with Harvey. So today I'm going to focus on the fundraising and the life cycle giving, which I think are probably the most interest to practitioners in general. And if we have time, which we won't, I'll talk a bit about the other papers about family ties and sort of alumni-specific questions. So just to briefly describe the data, these are data on alumni who graduated from 1972 to 2005, and the reason that it's cut off at 1972 is because that's when the university started keeping really, really accurate records on GPA and all these other things that are connected to the alumni database. And we observed them from 1983 to 2009. Why 1983? Because that's when they started digitizing all of their records, 100% of their records, and everything is all nicely formatted. So we know stuff about these people kind of before they arrive at the universities, gender and race. We know their admissions office rating on non-academic and academic suitability for admission on a 1 to 5 scale. We have their SAT scores and the type of high school they went to, public, private, parochial. We know a lot of stuff about them during their time at Anonymous University, their major and minor, their GPA, whether they got academic honors, and importantly, any extracurricular activities that they participated in. And then we know some stuff about them after their time at Anon U. We know if they have a postgraduate degree. We know where they live. We have some affinity proxies, like whether they subscribe to the alumni magazine, and we know if they are married to another Anonymous University alumnus or alumna. And in nearly everything we do, we include controls for class year cohort, so all the things that might have been constant true of the class of 2002, and also calendar year, or rather fiscal year in this case, to sort of control for everything that might be going on generally. Years since graduation and its square, sort of an age proxy, and if it's a multiple of 5, in reunion years, there tends to be more attention paid to the university. People's giving tends to be much higher. We also have information on their giving in a particular year, whether it was directed to certain activities, though most of the money donated to Anonymous University goes to the annual fund, sort of general purpose fund. And about 2/3 of these individuals have information on income proxies like their title or what field or sector they worked in. And I'll just preview it now. We've never found a real difference when we include the income proxies for that slightly smaller sample. And we use subsets of data. We use different shapes of the data to answer different questions throughout this. So in terms of giving, the giving year, the fiscal year begins in July, and until June, and this is important, until June, most of these solicitations are kind of impersonal. They're done mostly by mail or email. There are some exceptions to this, but the vast majority of this is a very regimented process. And when you get to June, if you still haven't given, you're sort of thrown in the pool where you might be called by a student, or far more likely, a fellow member of your class. and this is kind of the important thing when I get to the peer pressure. About 56% of giving opportunities are taken. By giving opportunity, I mean a person year. So in each fiscal year, once you give, you're not asked to give again until the following fiscal year. Very few people give more than one gift. Almost nobody gives more than one gift to the annual fund. They might give a specific gift to, say, the swim team, and then a gift to the annual fund. But about 56% of these giving opportunities are taken. The mean gift is about $1,100, and unsurprisingly in these cases, the median is far lower at $75. Over 90% of alumni give at least once since graduation. This is a very high affinity school, and about a quarter of them give it every opportunity. So they've given in every year since they graduated. This obviously tends to fall off after the first few years, but even if you look 10 or 12 years out, you're still in the 15 to 20% range for perfect giving. So the first question is being solicited by someone with whom you have a personal relationship more effective than someone else? And so this is obviously a really, really tricky question to estimate because the correlation between one individual's involvement in a charity and their peers' giving is not causal. People sort themselves. Our relationships are not randomly assigned. I don't think the IRB would let us do that. So the scope for experimentation here, I think, is very cool. The stuff that Reagan's doing with trying to exploit these social networks. You also have selective solicitation. You're likely to ask people who are more likely to give. If you've got a friend who is very stingy, you might not ever ask them. And there's also a question of whether the process is a process of information or a process of persuasion. So does Anya give to a charity I like because I have given her some information and she says, hey, I actually really like this charity, or does she give because I'm really annoying and she wants to shut me up? And so those are very, very different mechanisms there. So in this case, we've got a sort of nicely controlled environment that allows us to address a lot of these questions. The first is that everyone is solicited. So there's sort of no cold list that doesn't get solicited. So you don't have the selective solicitation problem. The charity is familiar to everyone. At minimum, everyone had the experience of graduating from this university. If you get a mailer from Anonymous University, you don't wonder, well, what is this? What is this place? Unless you drank too much while you were there. The roles in this case are very clearly defined. Someone is asking someone else for money. So while there may be the concern that I'm going to have to do you a favor later, it's not that we observe that I give some money and we also observe that John gives some money to the same charity and we don't really know, did he ask me, did I ask him, or did we just sort of collectively decide to give money? We've got a really, really extensive set of controls, as I described. And we use freshman year roommates for our kind of quasi-random assignment of who these individuals are. So the assignment of freshman year roommates is done not randomly, but on the basis of things that are highly unlikely to be related to giving later in life, like do you smoke and how late do you go to sleep. So these are people with whom you did not choose to live with, but they're people with whom you at least have some social relationship. Might be a negative one, but you have some knowledge of who these people are. But the issue is it still could be a shared experience that's driving it. So John and I were roommates. We both had a great time. He becomes a solicitor for the university. I become a big giver, and so we observe a correlation between those two things because our freshman year room was awesome. So we look at different aspects of volunteering. There's a lot of ways you can volunteer for the university, most of which don't have anything to do with raising money. So if it's just shared experience, we would observe that freshman year roommates who are volunteers in some other non-fundraising capacity for the university, we'd also see a correlation between their volunteering activity and giving by their roommates. We also look at the timing of the gift, in that, remember, these things don't happen until June. So we shouldn't see an effect until June. I don't call my former roommate until June because that's just not part of the process. So if we see an effect the rest of the year, spoiler alert, we don't, then we'd be worried that it's actually shared experience that's driving this rather than social pressure, peer pressure. So very briefly, the results. Those whose former freshman year roommates are solicitors in a given year are about 10% more likely to make a gift. So that's a difference of going from about 20 percentage points probability of giving in the month of June to about 22, 23 percentage points.
How much variation do you get in that?
Quite a bit. So there's a lot of...
Every year?
No, it's not the same guy every year, and there's a lot of transition. So like 60% of the people sort of do it for 1 or 2 years, then they don't do it for a couple of years, and they might do it again. And all of this holds even when you're controlling for individual fixed effects. So everything that might be constant about the individual donor, like their unobserved affinity. So the results are really, really robust. There's no effect on the size of the gift, conditional on giving. So it seems like this persuasion is really just give, and I'll leave you alone.
Well, it could be solicitors good at extracting money.
Sorry?
It could be that solicitors are good at extracting money.
That's true, and I don't want to make too much of the fact that the gift size is not there, because maybe those people might have given less and they're in fact persuaded to give the same amount as everyone else. So as I mentioned, the former roommates who are non-solicitor volunteers have no effect on giving. The solicitor roommate effect is only present in months in which there are personal solicitations, kind of the back half of May and June. And the solicitor roommate effect is only present in the years in which the individual has a solicitor roommate. We also find that when the former roommates are matched on characteristics, and I want to say that this paper was written a long time ago, these characteristics were things like race. Did you eventually get academic honors? So sort of a proxy for how much do you study. Did you join a social club eventually, which you don't do in your freshman year? And were you a varsity athlete? So if you were matched on those characteristics, you're more likely to respond to solicitation from a freshman year roommate. And the evidence is suggestive that this is due to weaker friendship formation rather than being less persuaded by someone with whom you're not matched on these characteristics. But that's suggestive evidence.
Why are you using freshman year instead of other years?
Because in other years you can choose who you live with. So your freshman year roommate is assigned to you. Yes.
I think you can ask. I know a lot about this at Honors University. I think you can ask to be housed with a friend when you show up.
The only choice you can make is if you have a twin, a same gender twin. That is the only time you have a choice in whether you live with that person or not. I have that on good authority from the housing office. Or if you're a celebrity, they actually house you by yourself, and they house you in a specific dorm where the security can be made a little bit tighter.
That's why you were by yourself.
So in 1987, I roomed with somebody I knew that I had requested. So we have changed the policy since then.
I don't know if we're talking about the same school, but.
Oh, you're looking before you said that. Okay.
And so, as part of as a separate question, we asked ourselves, after several impersonal solicitations, those emails and mailings that you get during the year, does an additional personal solicitation matter? And it's not entirely clear which one. You've already sort of implicitly said no 2 to 4 times throughout the year. Why would you say yes now? On the other hand, you've now got someone on the phone talking to you who you may or may not have a personal relationship with. And the idea for this project came from a friend of mine whose last name starts with Y, and he is convinced that the world has done him a great injustice because he is always at the back of the alphabet. And as it turns out, the names on the call lists for these solicitors are always alphabetical, and we heard from a number of them that they run out of time or energy before they get to the end of the list. And so what we found, we just sort of stacked this up and looked to see, first, did your last name have any predictive power on anything? And we really didn't find any, your GPA, anything like that. But if you were in the first quarter of the alphabet, you were about 5% more likely to make a gift than if you were in the last quarter of the alphabet. If you were in the relative to the last quarter of the alphabet. If you were in the second quarter of the alphabet, you were about 3.5% more likely to make a gift. And this was again a really robust result that we found consistently.
These alumni volunteers are supposed to record who they call.
So in the last several years, since we've been done with this project, there's a new system that actually now tracks exactly who you call, where you call, and they've also stopped putting these lists in alphabetical order since they saw this paper. So you can make an impact. And actually what's interesting about this is that these effects really tapered off after the year 2000. These effects were much, much stronger in the 80s and 90s and really started to taper off after. You might think it's kind of easier to get in touch with people. People have voicemail, they have email, and so on. And so these effects are sort of not there anymore, but they were quite strong prior to the information revolution. We saw no effect on the size of the gift here, which it just really seems, did you get the call or not? So did you respond to it or not? So then shifting gears, this paper on habit formation asks how giving when older is affected by giving patterns when young. And there's a lot of anecdotal evidence on these. These are quotes from development professionals saying that it's worth spending a lot of effort trying to extract very small gifts from people because you'll get them in the habit of opening their checkbook every time you call, and then in 30 years they'll give you $100 million. But of course this is purely anecdotal. Empirically, there's been, I wouldn't call it a controversy, there's some disagreement here. This paper just doesn't find strong evidence for habit formation. This other paper says, well, there's a strong correlation between previous giving but current giving, but it's not necessarily causal. Excuse me. And then yet another paper argues that encouraging young alumni to give is quite possibly likely to have them give more. So this is a really tricky question to get around because giving when young and giving when older are both driven by unobserved affinity for the university. If you like the school, you give it money when you're young and you give it money when you're older. Maybe you give it a lot of money or maybe you just give to it. So in this case, what we were looking at, we needed factors that affected your giving when you were young but not when you were older. So sort of a random shock to your likelihood to give to the university when you were young that really shouldn't have an effect on your giving when you're older, except in how it affects your giving when you're young. So we're looking for transitory shocks to your likelihood of giving, to your affinity for the school in your first few years after graduation. So the first one is whether your freshman year roommate is a solicitor for the university. I showed you that has an impact on whether or not you give in these years. And we also looked from this other paper that we had done on the performance of your own athletic team after you had graduated. We found that had an impact, particularly for men, on your likelihood of giving and how much you donated even years afterwards.
So you're saying you've established that it has a same-year effect, and now you want to know if it has a future effect as well?
Yes, if it has a future effect through the way it affected your giving earlier. So in this sort of naive model where we don't account for the fact that unobserved affinity is going to drive giving when you're young and giving when you're older, we see that a 10% increase in your average giving when you're young is associated with a 3% increase in your average giving when you're older. But of course, these are off of different baselines, so giving when older, the 3% in average giving when older is more dollars than the 10% in giving when young. But being a frequent giver, which I define as giving in each of the first 5 years, which about a third of the people do, being a frequent giver when you're young has no effect on giving when you're older. So in this uncorrected model, it would appear that you shouldn't spend a lot of time and effort trying to get people to really get into this habit. You should just pursue these dollars from people who want to give them to you. But when you correct for that problem, you find that the average amount given when young really doesn't have much of an effect on the amount you give when older. But in fact, is being a frequent giver when you're young is highly predictive of large gifts when you're older. So, and when you think about it, this makes some intuitive sense. You're talking about people in their early 20s, and so they might not have a high capacity to give dollars, but they can sort of signal their willingness to give. And if you get them in the habit of answering your call, you have their attention decades later when they have the capacity to give a lot of money. So the last thing that I'll talk about, unless people have questions on the other stuff, is this paper that Harvey and I just finished, which is looking at old people. And so there's a well-documented correlation in the literature between age and giving, and that that as people get older, giving tends to taper off. And by older, I mean well after their retirement years. So you can see here the drop-off starts to happen when people are really in their 70s or so. But we know when these people die because we have the information from the university and we have the obituaries from the alumni magazine. And what we found was that if you correct for impending death, the age relationship sort of goes away at these older years. Now we don't know exactly why that happens. You may shift your interests as you get sicker or closer to death. You may have fewer resources to give. You may just be in generally bad health, and so you're just less likely to answer. But from a practitioner's standpoint, again, these anecdotes and rules of thumb that John mentioned in the introductory remarks had often said, well, don't bother spending that much effort on asking for money from really old people because they don't give. Ask money from healthy, really old people. And we actually, in this case, we just didn't have enough power, but we looked at how you died from the obituaries, which is really depressing. But we found that people who sort of had accidental or sudden deaths didn't have this drop-off as they approach death, but people, particularly with neurological, who died from neurological problems, had a very, very steep drop-off, and we sort of found something between for things like heart disease and cancer. And on that cheery note, I'll stop here and take questions or briefly cover the other papers.
Any questions, remarks? Go ahead, sir. Does your data cover only annual gifts, or does it cover planned giving?
It doesn't really cover. It covers all gifts that were realized by the university. So it covers bequests if they were made, but it doesn't cover. I'm 33 and I put the university in my will and they know about it. So we don't have that.
What, split interest trust and things?
I honestly don't know. I think my guess would be the more complicated the legal vehicle for donating to the university, the less likely it is to be in these data.
The issue is whether the drop-off in giving is because it becomes more efficient to give in one of those forms than in annual giving as you approach death.
So it's
The escape of the capital gains tax on death.
so it's possible. We looked at some, again, suggestive evidence about people who give bequests and who don't give bequests, and we didn't really see any patterns in the drop-off with approaching death, differences in the patterns in drop-off. And my sense is that inter vivos giving while you're still alive, is sort of always at least weekly better than bequest giving. We were talking to David Julfane at the Treasury about doing some of this stuff, and again, I'm going to punt on that question because you don't seem convinced. But at least from his perspective, it seemed like the tax treatment was at least weekly better if you gave while you were still alive.
No, I trust him entirely.
But not me.
No, it's just a very complicated.
Yeah.
I'm skeptical a little on precautionary motives
Mhm.
as opposed to tax motives.
Right.
That it's weekly done.
Your slide showed younger giving 5 times more likely, or their gifts were going to be 5 times greater later in life if they were. I think it's interesting because we'll probably talk later about applying what we find in the research to. I'm speaking from a practitioner's world. A lot of foundations or other large funders are looking at charities and saying, why are you investing all these dollars in age groups that aren't going to produce a lot of money for you? And when you look at what we're doing with 20s and 30s, this is the way you take the data that's out there and say, here, let's show it to you, as opposed to just a charity saying to the funder, well, because this is the right thing to do. So there's been that gap, I think, and this is a nice opportunity to fill that. Absolutely.
And I should say that certainly for the accounting practices and the sort of reliance on annual metrics of efficiency and so on, which I think a lot of practitioners really dislike, in large part for precisely this reason, because you are building that donor pyramid and investing for the long run, and a lot of these metrics, Charity Navigator and so on, really reward just kind of one-off, capture as much money as you can, less so development.
So it's slightly off topic, but not really, because you work at the institution. So here I am on ESPN, and it talks about a monster year that Texas A&M had, $700 million. How in the hell they spend? As a practitioner, I'm like, I want to look under the hood and see how this all worked out. I'm just curious, is that something you're looking at, or how?
So I'm not looking at it specific. My advice would be get your own Johnny Manziel,
Yeah.
and that'll help. So I'm not looking at specifically that question because, of course, it's very hard to know exactly what's driving that. Kyle Field, the A&M Stadium, is in the process of being renovated. That was planned years before Johnny Manziel showed up. It was just very lucky that they happened to be doing the primary fundraising for a renovated stadium at the same time as you get a Heisman winner. So it's very difficult to say, well, no, it's this piece that's driving the uptick in giving versus that piece. And also our great academics.
Yeah,
Let's not forget.
Well, one really interesting thing about yours, and this is something that the other practitioners have, and my own experience, is the massive skewness in the amounts given. That for large organizations, you're really, really worried about the top 1-5% of the people, and you know all of the donations, right? Notwithstanding the questions about what are in the bequests. So I think that's actually an interesting thing for those who have access to the population for a given group, is to talk a little bit about that skewness. Because typically, you don't get that in surveys. You don't get that in from us.
Right. So in general, in most years, about 70% of the money comes from the top 1% of donors, and 1% of people who actually gave in that year. And you saw that where the mean was $1,100 and the median was $75. And also, this is actually not as skewed as it might be. Because remember, we started in 1972. And we're looking only up until the mid 2000s, so you're not getting that. I sold my company, I'm retiring. Here's $100 million. I think the largest gift in our sample is in the low tens of millions, as opposed to some of the substantially larger gifts that have been given by older alumni.
So you said you had a proxy for income on a subset of this data. For those younger alumni who gave, you said their average gift later on was 5% higher. As a percentage of, were you able to look at anything as approximately like a percentage of income?
No, we don't have any actual, as much information as this university has. They don't quite have that much. So these were just sort of general proxies. Do you work in finance? Do you work on Wall Street, and so on and so forth? And I'm getting the stop sign because it's lunchtime. So thank you very much for your patience.